Are you ready to do this episode?
I was born ready for this one.
I thought you were nervous about it.
I also am nervous about it. I'm Ben Smith.
I'm Nayeema,
and this is Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media.
So today we're going to take on this big question of bias in media, and it is an accusation that is lobbed, I don't know, every day, every minute, every second, Ben?
Every second.
This week, that conversation is really centered on two media stories, which both have to do with CBS. One, the Ta-Nehisi Coates CBS Morning interview with Tony DeCoppel. But this week, CBS executives came out with a statement, effectively criticizing DeCoppel's handling of that interview. There is also the decision by 60 Minutes to trim certain moments of the Kamala Harris interview, including an equivocating response on Gaza and Israel.
Yeah, tough week for them.
Yeah, they're in the crosshairs. But the bigger themes of these media moments are actually bigger than CBS, bigger than these two stories. They're actually about the challenge of covering two really thorny topics. One is Israel and Palestine, this war in the Middle East. And the second is political elections in the age of Donald Trump.
These are subjects in which there's no neutral ground. There's no safe space for journalists to hold. And you're basically always going to be accused of bias, which, by the way, isn't an excuse to be biased. But I think that's the thing we're all wrestling with.
And of course, these are both particularly timely conversations this week in the wake of the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attack and of Israel's now expanding war in the Middle East.
Yeah, and in the October of an election year, it's sort of risen to a dull roar that makes it a kind of unavoidable topic of conversation, which I think is why we wanted to talk about it.
We're bringing on a former colleague of ours from the New York Times, James Bennet. He's someone who I think has very much been at the center of it and also been a kind of character in other people's assessment of bias in journalism or lack thereof, particularly in the New York Times story.
Yeah, he's been a combatant and a character for sure.
All right, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back.
It's only fall, but the coming holidays are a huge deal in marketing every year. How are you preparing for them, and what role do you think AI plays this holiday season?
I was reading on Think with Google, an Ipsos study, which showed that last July, so a couple of months ago now, about a third of American consumers had already started their Christmas shopping. I'm not that organized. I'm pretty sure you're not that organized as well, but it speaks to the importance of starting early. One of the things we're seeing is that all sorts of smart retailers are taking advantage of AI to enhance the shopping experience. So using Gemini, if you actually get richer product descriptions written, which Gemini can do at scale for every product and every sort of use case, and put it on your website, customers are actually more confident in buying because they know better about the product. And we're seeing higher sell rates from people who are actually doing that sort of work. I've seen some really interesting work. Booking.com is an interesting company. They sell hotel rooms and experiences. They built a chatbot experience really enhanced by AI to actually navigate the millions of possibilities of rooms, events, and experiences they sell to create a truly interactive shopping experience. AI making shopping for travel, which is not always the easiest thing, a much more enjoyable experience.
Where do we find out more about this, Josh?
Head over to thinkwithgoogle.com. There's loads of content about retailing, shopping, and the use of AI for the holidays.
So usually we'd introduce this topic at length before we introduce the guest, but today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to have the conversation with James and use that as fodder for a longer debrief. How does that sound, Ben?
Yeah, I think that this is one where if we start trying to explain to you what media bias is, we will either never stop or you'll really hate us. Because it's just, I think the sort of core of it is that there's no absolutely neutral place to stand, and you're always coming from somewhere. And as you start to explain to people what media bias is, of course, you're implicating your own experiences, your own story.
I love it. You're like, we're not going to explain it to you, and then you went ahead and explained it, kind of.
Explained why I'm not going to explain it. You know it when you see it.
Or you think you see it everywhere. Also, that happens.
Yeah. You know it when you see it, but you're wrong. That's what we're here to explain to you.
That's what we're here. So let's talk about our guest, James Bennet, and why we thought he was such a good guest to have today.
Yeah, so we thought of James because he had what to me is the single job that is at the fulcrum of these experiences of being a journalist accused of bias, which is he was the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times in the early 2000s, just before social media. But, at a time when he was covering specifically Hamas in Gaza and facing claims from Palestinians, from Israelis that he was being unfair, wrestling with, for instance, how to use the word terrorism.
Right, something he published a long internal memo about that has been the kind of topic of conversation for journalists for a decade plus post.
Yeah, and went from there to the Atlantic, where he, in the blogging years, basically opened this very wide aperture for different points of view, different opinions, from Andrew Sullivan to Ta-Nehisi Coates, and then went to the New York Times, where he was in some ways trying to do the same. First hire was a conservative columnist, Bret Stephens, and eventually ran into the crucible of 2020, the intense arguments about race, and the narrowing of what a lot of people at the New York Times and readers of the New York Times felt the New York Times ought to be saying.
Right, and it's a name that people might recognize from the Tom Cotton controversy, the decision to publish an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton in the summer of 2020, which led ultimately to James's resignation. And actually, James was my boss, or my boss's boss, at Times Opinion.
His most important qualification,
Yeah,
in fact, was that
exactly.
he was your boss.
But we wanted to bring on James, not just because he's found himself at the center of so much controversy, which I guess would just happen over a course of multi-decade career in journalism.
Well, he's, had unerring instincts to the center of these unbelievably impossible things, starting with being the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times.
So let's bring in our guest, James Bennet. Ben and I were just speaking about our reticence to kind of take on this issue of media bias and on Israel and Gaza in particular. So we just wanted to give you the opportunity before we jump in to caveat or air whatever hesitations you may have had in accepting this podcast invitation with us.
I mean, we'll be here for the full 45 minutes if I start cataloging all the things that make me antsy and nervous and worried about not making myself understood. Because it's a hard subject that people, for very good reason, bring a ton of emotion to, and in a lot of cases, actual real trauma to.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to talk this episode in a pretty big picture way about, this moment. It's the month before the election. It's the middle of a war. Everyone's sort of, phasers are set all the way up on allegations of media bias. And I just think you had this pretty unique experience fairly early in your career in what I think of as the absolute worst job in the world, or at least in journalism, for this reason, which is you were the New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief from 2001 to 2006. And that is just the role that has the most intense focus of arguments, particularly about media bias, letters to the editor, all of these things, nervous bosses, the whole thing. And I am curious if you could just sort of begin by talking a little about like that role and the scrutiny that came with it.
Yeah. First off, I was really in the role from '01 through '04, from a week before the 9/11 attacks, and then back and forth, for another year, because there was Yasser Arafat died. There was the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Just to be clear, we're talking about kind of a narrow form of coverage here. We're talking about the people who try to supply the basic facts about what's happening on the ground there. Not the opinion journalists, the people who are trying to hopefully help all those other folks form their views and hopefully help guide policymakers.
And somehow those are the ones everybody is most furious at, in my
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
The newsroom itself.
So it's really hard. And I was a big believer in the idea that there's so many ways we as reporters pat ourselves on the back and justify what we're doing. And one of the very basic ones is to tell ourselves if everybody's mad at you, you must be doing a good job. And I think it's really important in a role like that Jerusalem job to make sure you don't fall into that trap. Just because everybody's mad at you, you may be in fact getting it wrong. And it's a job that teaches and enforces humility if you take it seriously. And anyway, when I was there, it was easier than today. We were well into the email era and well into the internet era, but it was the pre-social media era with everything that has brought with it in terms of how it's changed the audience's interaction with journalists and the ethos of newsrooms, like profound change, right?
And what was your experience of readers' reactions? And sort of what did you emerge thinking about sort of people's feeling about, and accusations, really extensive accusations from all quarters that you were biased, that you were carrying Israeli or Palestinian water?
It's so hard in that job. Like then, there were days then, because there was attack and reprisal and attack, and there were days I would go through 3 shifts of editors rewriting the same story, for the web. And the problem was readers would come in and engage with the top of the story, and if you were pro-Israel, you'd be like, why are you writing about the Israeli reprisal when the what you should be writing about the suicide bombing? And I was like, well, I did write about that 6 hours ago when it was the lead, and now it's been pushed down by something else. And there are certain things about the rhythm of the news cycle that create confusion, and as a result create a lot of anger that I also wound up dealing with. And so much of the job, and one of the reasons I think people shoot at it too, is that it really enforces a lot of things that even then were becoming unfashionable. The both sidesism, false balance, the voice from nowhere, all those terms that get used now. And I would use different words for those things. It's fairness, it's trying to be objective, and it's trying to represent reality with some humility. But yeah, something happens and you quote the Palestinian version of what it was and you quote the Israeli version of what it was. And even in cases where I witnessed something myself, I would find myself needing to do that because you can't be everywhere. You can't see everything.
We sort of were interested in talking to you in part because you have this unusual experience of having had 20 years to reflect on something that is happening right now in more or less exactly the same way, only more intensely. And I think it's, it hasn't, in some ways, has not changed very much.
There's something inevitably, and this is where there's a lot of anger, there's something inherently morally despicable about the journalist's role because you are trying to stand outside this conflict. In my view, in order to do a job like that in the way it needs to be done, in the hopes of helping people, ideally grope towards peace and a solution, you have to stand outside it and you have to represent all sides. You have to try to understand the politics in, all its complexity. I spent a lot of time with Hamas folks. You were able to do that then. And I'm not drawing a false equivalence here, but I also spent a lot of time with settlers. I spent a lot of time with all sorts, just trying to understand and explain the ideology. It was core to the job. But, you're also standing apart from, you're watching, children get blown up or shot in the head. You're counting the bodies. You're looking at the wounds so you can try to figure out who did what and writing about it. Not in a clinical way. I tried, to communicate the horror of it.
I'm having this reaction to morally despicable because I feel like I don't know if it's morally despicable, but it's certainly morally disappointing to people. Anyone you're in conversation with at dinner is morally disappointed in you for not having a clear kind of moral clarity, right?
Yeah.
The desire for a journalist to have that, but
Yeah.
to be objective is to disappoint everyone in some way.
And by the way, like the Palestinian correspondents in Gaza, the Israeli correspondent there, it's hard enough for an American in that situation to try to do the job with a degree of detachment and all the rest of it without, it's so hard. It's so hard to do it well.
You wrote, I'm sure, hundreds, if not thousands of pieces on the Middle East, but one piece in particular from May of 2004 is heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. I want to just take a minute to introduce the piece and read a little bit from it, and then ask you, James, to talk about what you were trying to do there and what the response was. It's called Letter from the Middle East. Children fill ledger of death, no matter how or how many. And it's this kind of, really piece about children with bullet holes in their heads who the Israelis are claiming they haven't shot. You have these two graphs in it that I'd like to read. One, you say, many witnesses said there are no gunmen. The matter is still under investigation, the army said. Some things here are what they seem, and some are not. Israeli soldiers have camouflaged themselves in Palestinian vehicles. Militants have hidden smuggling tunnels in the basement of houses. Each side plays on what it considers the other's habit of deception to cast doubt on claims about the killing. And then later on you say, whether the casualties on any given day are on one side or the other or both, there is also in a dark space somewhere a reality. There is a dead child. There is an exit wound. How many dead children is too many is a question often asked by Palestinians and Israelis, but it shows no hint of being resolved. What are you trying to capture in that moment as you're trying to answer the question, who shot this child? And to some extent, does it, how does it matter?
Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to get at, Nayeema. It's funny, this stuff really is upsetting.
It's okay, take a minute.
gosh, wow. Excuse me. I,
Yeah.
I, that was a really crazy, I wrote that piece during a massive Israeli incursion into Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip. Rafah's been a lot in the news again lately. A giant refugee camp on the border down there with Egypt, and one of the most desperate places I've ever been. And there'd been a lot of violence. The Israelis were trying to get rid of the smuggling tunnels that were being used to bring in weapons for Hamas and other groups. And there'd been and a lot of people had been killed, including a lot of children. And I was one of the only reporters who was able to get in, just because I went in early and was able to get down there. And I guess I wrote that piece trying to communicate a little bit what I felt at the time, like the deep futility, even about my own role. Because I was there kind of counting the dead. As usual, the Palestinians said X number of people died. The Israelis had their numbers. The Palestinians said they were shot dead by snipers. The Israelis claimed. So I was going and sort of examining the bodies and dealing with the understandable anger of these Palestinian doctors who just like, why are you want to see the body of this dead child? I'll show you the exit wound. Here it is. A hole the size of a grapefruit in a child's face. And you just feel like, how many dead children does it, like, it doesn't matter in a sense. Like, one dead child is too many, and anybody exposed to the conflict. God, guys, wow. It has been 20 years.
But it also hasn't, right? You read this
Yeah,
all the time.
right,
You're still
right,
obviously a journalist. You're
right.
you're a person of the world.
Well, and you just think about the families, and again, here I am, both sides, right? How horrible that I would say both sides, but the truth is, it's horrible on both sides. Like, it really is, and I think it's important. I think it is for us, certainly as journalists, but also as readers, should have empathy, for people on both sides of this, or all sides, I would even say, because politics is intricate. And one dead child really should be too many. And the piece is just over the top because I was in such a state at the time. But I was trying to get at some of that.
Yeah.
Not a lot of journalism from 20 years ago holds up the way that piece does. So I
Oh,
would
thanks,
recommend
man.
people read it. I mean, all these debates, gosh, they're so fresh. But and that was about the sort of difficulty of determining the facts. The other layer is the language that you also, I think, have been thinking about and working on for the last 20 years. But you wrote a famous memo at the Times about when you use the word terrorism. So much of the energy on the internet right now involves yelling at journalists, editors, correspondents about choices of who to call a terrorist, who not to call a terrorist, things like that. And I'm curious, should we care that much?
Just a quick digression. One of the things that seemed horrible to me about life there is the way politics kind of suffuses absolutely everything. And so, where you live, what you eat, every choice you make, and certainly choice of language. And one of the things that makes me so sad about where we find ourselves these days in the U.S. is it's the same thing has become true here. It's like your fashion choices, the language you use, so much more
Mm.
than back then. All of these things have become tells and reasons to have fights about, what are you capitalizing, what are you not. Also, grammar has become another arena for conflict. Obviously, words have always been pregnant with political meaning. I don't pretend there, but you know what I mean? It's just a much more. So this is a huge, endless source of struggle with coverage from the region is when do you use certain words? If you use certain words, are you making a political statement or are you advancing understanding? You know?
You drew an interesting and specific line that if Hamas kills people in Israel proper, that's terrorism. If they kill civilians in the West Bank and Gaza, you describe it differently. A Hamas fighter killed in Israel, I guess, is a dead terrorist, and a Hamas fighter, the same guy killed in Gaza, is a militant. How do you feel about that? Is that the right line?
I mean, one of the arguments I made then is that, I worried about using the word terrorism for the reason that you seem to be taking a side in the conflict if you use that word. On the other hand, I couldn't pretend that the word doesn't have meaning, and to not use it in some circumstances was also, I thought, to commit a political act. I mean, I do think terrorism is the deliberate use of violence against civilians for political effect. And Hamas was doing that when it killed civilians inside Israel. And I felt like it was wrong not to use the word in those circumstances. Now, we can have the argument, if a state uses violence against civilians, is that state terrorism? Then you have to prove, in my mind, that it was a deliberate use of violence against. There was no question that a member of Hamas blowing themselves up in a movie theater was out to kill civilians. You have to have the whole argument about what the fact pattern was. And I'm honestly unresolved on that question myself, even whether you should use the word in the context of state violence.
But in the case of, say, settler violence, you would use that word, right, in the West Bank, to the extent there was.
Nayeema, in all honesty, I cannot remember at the time if I did. And I certainly wrote a lot about settler violence, and I can't remember.
Yeah, why is that language different? If settlers are violent against civilians, Palestinian civilians, why would that language be different by the same principles?
I'm just trying to remember a case where there's been a lot more of that kind of violence in recent years. At the time,
I'm less asking you about what you did back then because it's hard to, but I'm just saying it's interesting as I'm listening to you hear this now because we talk a lot about settler violence. That's a term that exists and is written a lot, but it is kind of a euphemism, it seems like, for something else. And we, to the extent that which it's backed by, extremists in a party, we don't talk about that as being state-sponsored terrorism the way we might talk about it on
yeah,
another end, right? So there is something weird happening in the language.
I mean, I definitely talked about, the settlements as being illegal under international law and evidence of the Israeli occupation. I'm just trying to remember a case that I covered of a settler committing that same kind of violence. I don't know. Here I am. I mean, it sounds like I'm making,
No,
fine distinctions that shouldn't really have any maybe meaning, but inevitably they do. I really, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I think these are the kinds of conversations that happen in newsroom, which is why the kind of reductive conversation that happens on Twitter around this headline and let me correct that for you with my red pen is so frustrating because these are the kinds of conversations that we've had
Yeah.
in the opinion section, and they are really thoughtful, they are really deliberate, and they are really personal. You think about them, you carry a burden of them, and people just think it's like typing 14 letters into a screen.
Yeah, and the difference, it's in a way, right, like the stakes and the importance and the amount of energy that goes into figuring out who shot who and who
Mhm.
shot a child feels so much more important than the very difficult close calls about which language you use, which are unresolvable and challenging, but also at some level secondary to that. I mean, I think that is how most journalists actually see it, secondary to the fact gathering. And you get out into this public space and it gets reversed.
That's really a good point, both of those.
Yeah.
And Naima, I really appreciate what you say. And in my experience, these are all really morally serious people who are trying to get it right on deadline, by the way.
Yes. At
And
speed, on deadline and in competition with
right
other news organizations.
before the
Yeah.
next bomb explodes, and they have to do it all. So it's again, I'm making excuses maybe, but it's
It's nuanced.
yeah.
A final question sort of on this topic before we move off the Middle East. Another layer of it is obviously I think journalists on the ground trying very, very hard to be fair and get the facts right, kind of regardless of from a lot of different outlets, taking a lot of criticism. There are these micro disputes about language that drive everybody crazy. I think the most legit critique of the US media is that at some fundamental level, we see things from the Israeli point of view. They're our ally, deep cultural ties, and even as you're trying to get the facts right, even as you're trying to get the language right, a lot of American journalists, of all ethnicities, by the way, basically see the world primarily from an Israeli point of view, and the Palestinian point of view comes second. And for a lot of the Arab media, for instance, it's the reverse. That has always struck me as a more legitimate critique than a lot of the nitpicking. I'm curious what you make of that.
And what do you mean when you say see it from the Israeli point of view?
Are based in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, have deeper relationships with people, with Israelis, live in a country that does tons of business with Israel and in which Israeli politicians talk to the Congress. Just, that our sort of default when we're not thinking about it of these two infinitely complex dueling narratives often slides into the Israeli one. I think it's probably true of me, for instance. And I'm curious if you feel that.
It certainly wasn't the view that the pro-Israel audience had of the coverage, or the Israeli government tended to
No.
have of the coverage, which was that foreign correspondents tend to be captured by the Palestinians and become sympathetic to them because they are, underdog doesn't even begin
Right.
to capture it, and I think there is a lot of sympathy in the press corps for the plight of the Palestinians. I honestly, I don't think I'm the right person to judge that, Ben. It's interesting. There are all sorts of biases built into the nature of the coverage that always worried me. Even the disproportionate amount of coverage. I would have correspondents come in from other parts of the world, to help out during that time because it was so crazy. And they would be just dumbfounded that we're writing front page stories about a couple people being killed, on one side or the other when people were getting massacred on their beats and there'd be no story in the paper. So that's an inherent bias that
Yeah.
in some ways misrepresented the reality of life there at the time, which was, people are killing each other, but many more people are going to the beach and living their lives, starting companies in Gaza as well as in Israel. And you try to write those stories too, but the conflict, so that's one huge bias that sort of, if it bleeds, it leads, and in that conflict more than any other on the face of the earth. So that was always something that worried me. That's a built-in bias.
We look at the American media coverage versus, say, the British media coverage. Do you see a difference, James? Maybe that's a way to kind of ask
Yeah,
you
that's
a similar
helpful,
question.
Nayeema. Yeah, I think there's certainly at the time I was there. I just hate to engage they were more pro-Palestinian there because I feel like I'm doing an unfairness to those correspondents who, this is where the balance question gets really, really hard, which is, what is not today's story and is it fair, but what's the whole body of work, and is it clearly tilting towards greater sympathy for the victims on one side than on the other, or to the point of view of one side rather than the other. And maybe that's what you were getting at, Ben. Do we, as American journalists, inherently wind up writing more pieces from the Israeli? Naeem, I would say that that's fair, that at least then, the BBC, for example, did devote more attention, more focus, I think. But I'm just going to sound
It's hard to
defensive. I
say.
spent
Yeah.
so much of my time trying to I really did, and maybe I didn't do
Yeah.
a good job of it, but I really did write a lot of stories from the West Bank and Gaza where I tried to, give some sense of what life was like under occupation and really try to explain the effect it was having on the society. So I don't know. I feel really silly and embarrassed about that emotional moment. I just I don't know where that came from, and I do know where it came from, but I'm sorry about that.
I think it's so human and wonderful, actually. And I honestly want to play it for every single person who sends autocorrect on a headline. Yeah.
I don't want anything to sound like I felt sorry for the reporters or for myself.
Well, that's the job, right?
Yeah, it's the job.
Something that's been in the news this week, James, has obviously been the CBS story, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the interview with Tony DeCoppel and his peers on CBS Morning, though Tony really ran that interview. When you were editor of The Atlantic, James, you published Coates's Case for Reparations in 2014. That really launched Ta-Nehisi's career. I think we also did something with him at the Times when I was there in 2019, maybe through you. But
Yeah.
he outlined the moral case for reparations to Black Americans, the practicalities on how the government should enact reparations. And now he's in the news with this new book condemning Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Let's first play a clip of that exchange, that CBS News exchange, and then we'll have a couple questions for you about it.
Ta-Nehisi, I want to dive into the Israel-Palestine section of the book. It's the largest section of the book. And I have to say, when I read the book, I imagine if I took your name out of it, took away the awards and the acclaim, took the cover off the book, the publishing house goes away, the content of that section would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. And so then I found myself wondering, why does Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I've known for a long time, read his work for a long time, very talented, smart guy, leave out so much? Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel, in any condition, has a right to exist?
Well, I would say the perspective that you just outlined, there is no shortage of that perspective in American media. That's the first thing I would say. I am most concerned always with those who don't have a voice, with those who don't have the ability to talk. I have asked repeatedly in my interviews whether there is a single network, mainstream organization in America with a Palestinian American bureau chief or correspondent who actually has a voice to articulate their part of the world. I've been a reporter for 20 years. The reporters of those who believe more sympathetically about Israel and its right to exist don't have a problem getting their voice out. But what I saw in Palestine, what I saw on the West Bank, what I saw in Haifa in Israel, what I saw in the South Hebron Hills, those were the stories that I have not heard. And those were the stories that I was most occupied with. I wrote a 260-page book.
So James, what do you make of that conversation as someone who knows, the principles involved, or one of them at least, and has grappled with that same kind of question and coverage?
Well, are we, first of all, I'm curious what you guys think of this whole, controversy, this particular interview. The righteousness on all sides of this one makes me kind of grind my teeth a little bit. It was a very adversarial, I would say, interview. And there's probably no one in the world I would worry less about in an adversarial interview than Ta-Nehisi Coates. And sure enough, I thought he handled it with grace, and he fought his corner very well. And the result was, it was actually an interesting interview. But everybody's obviously up in arms about it on one side or the other. And maybe this isn't what morning shows are supposed to do, or something that was too out of keeping with the... If you imagine the counterfactual where he comes... I mean, look, he's written a book. I haven't read the book yet, but he's taken very strong positions. If they only asked him a bunch of softballs, it would have been... CBS would have looked ridiculous.
Yeah, and it didn't seem like he wanted... It wasn't like he answered the question. He took it in stride, I think. I don't know, Ben, what do you think of that interview?
Yeah, I think that there, as you say, lots of self-righteousness. The most boring and true answers do have to do with the nature of morning television and people's emotions inside CBS.
What I think it's valuable is it's an exchange between two people who disagree. And it's a kind of exchange that we don't have enough of in some ways. And the fact that Ta-Nehisi, I think, handled that question, I do think ending with that extreme question of, is it because you don't believe, as opposed to just asking the question, do you believe Israel has a right to exist? I think there's a kind of more elegant way to frame that question and actually get a response. And I thought Ta-Nehisi actually handled it in stride and was willing to engage with it, that it became a more revelatory conversation than a lot of what we see happening, especially as media has fragmented and splintered, and you can read what you want to read on the Free Press, you can read what you want to read in Intercept, and here's a conversation that's happening at a time where no one expects it to happen, and Gayle King certainly didn't seem to expect it to happen, but you learned something from that interaction. And then the response, now of course the news story has moved to, well, what's CBS's response, and why was that response timed to critique Tony on October 7th? And now what about the insensitivity there? And Shari, I think, is giving an interview to Sarah Fisher of Axios as we tape this, where she's come out, Shari Redstone, of CBS Paramount fame, to come out and defended Tony. So it's become this huge political stuff that Ben would have written an amazing, 1,800 words about for the Times.
No, and the real lesson that CBS will take from this is to never let anybody disagree in good faith on complicated topics again. I think every morning show producer will take that memo, for sure.
Wow.
Really? Yeah.
That's depressing.
I agree with everything you said, Naeema. I totally agree. I mean, and that's why everybody's writing about what the questions were, and nobody's reporting what the answers were and what the engagement was, and
Yes.
kind of that's actually was interesting.
Yeah.
We used to call that journalism. I certainly believe we shouldn't be afraid of this debate. I don't think that's an alternative to not engage these sorts of questions. Obviously, I didn't get deeply into it on CBS.
Yeah, I mean, and part of it was, I think, that Coates's view is, for a bunch of the media, kind of unacceptably left wing. The idea, which is his view, is Israel's an apartheid state. People are overthinking the history. This is outrageous, and the U.S. needs to. I mean, that's a.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess, and you're saying that ought to be within the spectrum of acceptable debate.
Look, I haven't read the book yet,
Yeah.
but I know
Right.
the writer and I know his work. And my assumption is that these are morally serious arguments that don't ignore history. Certainly hasn't been his pattern in the past.
I want to move on to your own real start turn in the kind of media wars. These culture wars came in the summer of 2020 when you were pushed out of the Times. This has been covered ad nauseum, including by yourself in a, I don't know, 60,000 word, 16,000 word. I don't know, James. How long was that piece in The Economist?
I guess I supplied the nausea.
You came in, years later, and I really appreciated the piece that Ben, when you started Semaphore, you ran a great interview with James actually for your first media newsletter, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, James keeps saying yes and regretting it.
Yeah,
He doesn't
Ben got me to say all sorts of stupid stuff the way he does.
But in this Economist magazine piece, which is called When the New York Times Lost Its Way, you wrote, "The reality is that the Times is becoming the publication through which America's progressive elite talks to itself about an America that does not really exist." I'm curious if you think that still holds, or if you think the Times, and I should just note that I still contribute to the Times in Opinion Video, but do you think the Times has absorbed that critique and started to row that back? I mean, just in your observations of the media world, do you think 2020 was a particular summer?
I do think it was a particular summer, and that was a
Yeah.
particularly insane time for reasons we all know, in our politics. And by the way, I think we haven't really reckoned with that, and I look forward to books that explain that period to me, maybe. I can't speak to, I'm not a close reader of the New York Times anymore, Naeema. So I,
Oof, that's a subtweet if I ever heard
yeah,
one, James.
well, I mean, I just am not. And
Uh-huh.
so I don't think I'm a great judge. I've read coverage, and Ben, you've done some of this work that suggests the Times is trying to row it back. And I no longer have to care about that. It's an institution I care a lot about, but I don't have to. It's not my problem anymore. So I hope they do, and I hope they understand the scope of the problem and they're really getting their hands around it.
That article, and I think your sort of martyrdom from this perspective was like embraced by, I think, some of probably the specifically same people who were writing you furious notes about your coverage of Israel. And I think that there's a impulse to take you as a kind of conservative media dissident. And I think you're something else. And I wonder if you can kind of put your finger on it, or maybe, because it sounded like that makes you kind of uncomfortable.
Look, I'm not a hero. I'm not a martyr. I'm not a victim of any sort. And whenever I talk about any of this, and I worry about it even earlier, I sound self-pitying or something. Like the problems, it's Bill Clinton would call all these problems first-class problems. So if I could just caveat it with that. But being a journalist to me has always meant being an outsider and not being a member of any tribe. Except the tribe of journalists, and we all used to have our backs because we were a part of that tribe. And that's one of the things that's made me saddest about what you've seen happen in so many newsrooms. But, your job really is to make everybody a little uncomfortable. And your job really is to challenge, period, And it's not to go along. It's not to affirm. It's not to... I mean, only if the truth, as you understand it, as you can apprehend it and report it, takes you there. I think this is the role journalists need to play in a big pluralistic democracy in order to safeguard self-government. I don't know what the alternative is. Moral clarity, to use the term Nayeema used this earlier, it doesn't. All that does is intensify the fight. It doesn't help.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, it's like people will ask, or media organizations, these objective news organizations, not just even the Times, but the Times is a particular case, too beholden to the left, especially after 2020, especially after, the kind of subscription model just means that you're incentivized to retain subscriptions from the people who keep paying you for the coverage that do you think it's mainstream news is too beholden to the left, or is it too beholden to its own sense of neutrality or posterity? Because sometimes I would find this frustrating, the sense that like you're not writing for the readers of 2024, you're writing for the readers of 2078, and they'll look back and say, what a good job we did being objective and not taking a position on this issue that has been settled by history in one way or the other, and then this same board will have to apologize for in 2078.
It's funny, Nayeema, when I was the editorial page editor, one of the things that was sort of, you do is you'd look back at positions the Times had taken over the years, 75 years ago, and just marvel at how wrongheaded they were. And all that made me think was, how harshly they're going to judge us for all the things that they're going to consider just ridiculously retrograde or wrong in one way or another. And it was, again, one of those things that's useful in hopes of staying, somewhat humble, to remind yourself of. I do think we write for our audience today. I worry a lot about sort of reader capture, audience capture in the subscription model. I do think that that's a dynamic that's posing a deep challenge to a lot of media organizations. I used to love the idea of the subscription model because what better bulwark of your quality could there be than getting, somebody to pay for it, an individual. But in fact, advertisers had, we'd beaten them into some degree into submission, or they were more grown up, and
So you're saying we gotta beat the readers into submission now?
I think we have to communicate better with readers, Ben. I think,
I mean, it is interesting. Readers of the Times right now on the left are so mad, and I think these probably are subscribers to some degree, that the Times is too nice to Trump. And even as a lot of most of the kind of media bias allegations we're talking about come from the right, but in some ways the most heated ones, the ones the Times is most reactive to, I think right now, actually come from the left. And yeah, I don't know. So the answer is just like stop looking at social media. I don't know.
I think that is the answer. I used to feel like back when my editor days, I used to feel like I would make the trade that if people could post on Twitter if they never actually read Twitter. Like the real pain came from reading and the effect that had. And again, the way social media pulls you into a tribe and makes you seek affirmation. All of that was so damaging.
You were talking about objectivity, something that's been around 100 years in journalism, not much longer than that, and something that really was supported by advertisement because advertisers were excited to get away from the kind of, in the, I guess, early 1900s, late 1800s, what must have been outside of the AP, pretty biased reporting from, newspapers taking extremely strong positions. So
Can I say, I know I am old school, or I sound like, get off my lawn or whatever. And I don't, let me say quickly, I believe objectivity is a myth. I think the struggle towards objectivity has value. But I don't think we should cling to any of this stuff for its own sake. I just think it served the Republic better than whatever it is we have today.
Just a final question for you, James, because another kind of vector of this social media world is that everyone is a personal brand. Everybody's a byline. Everybody's a big name. Your Why I Left the New York Times video would have been the most viewed thing you could have possibly done on YouTube. And you have instead chosen to go to a place without bylines, The Economist, where like connoisseurs know that you are Lexington, but readers might not. I'm curious, in this age of name brand influencers, how it feels to be pseudonymous.
I mean, to the extent it functions as a journalist protection program, I guess I feel relieved to be in it. But that's not, look, I'm really uncomfortable. There's no bad, again, it's Nayeema, I'm just a fossil, right? The
no,
brand,
you're not. I don't want to call you a fossil.
No, but it's fair. I don't like we didn't even, at the New York Times, you weren't even supposed to use the word brand at one point because the style guys would kill you for it, because in another context besides marketing, because it's the language of advertising. You get scolded for using the language of advertising to talk about something as important as politics or, God, help us, media. And now we've all, unironically, utterly embraced
No, the
language.
marketers have won.
Yeah, the marketers have won, and it's not. And I totally get it. Like, to make it in this industry today, to become successful, I don't fault any of the journalists for it. It's just where the incentives have carried us, and it does create a sort of all against all environment inside newsrooms. And one of the things I love about The Economist that I discovered, the no byline thing, it selects for people who are comfortable with that. And these aren't people with low egos. It's not that. But they're really committed to the collective enterprise. And I love that about the place. That matters a lot because you represent The Economist and it affects them because they're so invested in the institution. And that's where I'm really a fossil and where I despair about the age we're living in. And I think institutions matter. It's like they matter. That how we pass values on, like families. And we're living in this era of just institutional, not just decay, but disintegration.
Yeah, it's certainly distrust. Certainly distrust.
Sorry, that was a long speech.
No, that's great.
You've got my vote.
Okay.
Thank you so much, James, for joining us. We've overstayed our welcome, but thank you so much.
It's great to see you.
Thanks a lot for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
And by the way, as a sign of just how complicated this issue is, shortly after that interview, James actually wrote to myself and Ben and said, "One answer I realized I really botched was to your question, Nayeema, about settlers. I kept trying to think of a story I actually did in which a settler killed a Palestinian. But the simple answer is yes. If there was a case where a settler killed a Palestinian for political reasons, I would certainly think that qualifies as, quote, terrorism."
It was great to hear, just the screamy, often dishonest, or at least incredibly angry conversation about journalism in the Middle East. The gap between that and just the work people there are trying to do every day is so disturbing. And this is I was sort of hoping we could have him on because I think it's so hard to talk even to journalists who are in the field right now, who are having these experiences right now, and who are on defense constantly and aren't in a position to talk so openly. And his experiences 20 years ago could have been yesterday, honestly, almost everything he described. But he has had this, opportunity to reflect, although also you really heard him just go right back there. And it's with no emotional distance.
You said something interesting in a way that echoes what Ta-Nehisi Coates said, which I'm not saying that you're the same as him or have all his same opinions, but this idea that there's an overexposure of the Israeli perspective in American media and that you yourself are guilty of it. Do you really think that? I mean, it's so funny to me that in saying, you're calling out this bias, you're saying, oh, well, there might be this bias, and I myself am guilty of that bias. It's such an interesting
Well, I think the way
moment for
people
me.
use the word bias is just very, I think it's a very complicated situation. I think, Israel is a major U.S. ally, and its, political figures speak to Congress. And
So it impacts your sourcing and therefore your story, basically.
yeah, and I mean, and you come up covering politics, these issues are very front and center. And I think there's sort of a default reflex toward an Israeli point of view, maybe not the only Israeli point of view. And as James said, there's a countervailing impulse among journalists and correspondents to sympathize with the underdog. And so I think these are complicated things, but I don't even necessarily mean that kind of instinct of sympathy toward an Israeli perspective, how that plays out in the journalism can be complicated. But I do think that's a legitimate criticism of American media.
I mean,
Or just a legitimate point about American media. No one does come from nowhere. And I think the Arab media obviously comes from a totally different side, the European media largely from a third place.
What do you think? I mean, you strike me as someone who's always been outside of the culture wars, kind of rolling your eyes at them while covering them with is that fair?
Biting my tongue.
Yeah.
Closing my
yeah. Closing your eyes at them, is
Yeah.
that better? It's your blind spot?
I mean, I think the thing that is interesting about in talking to people like James and probably like me is we're often very inconsistent. The goal isn't consistency. The goal isn't to develop a fully baked worldview. It's to poke at power and poke at people who are really sure of what they think.
I think actually, and I probably fall a little bit into that category too, but inconsistent, it's hard to pin down. But I actually think there's a greater consistency in that than the kind of expedient consistency of taking a certain set of viewpoints that have been picked up by one political party or one political faction and saying, I subscribe, which is, you see a lot of people do. You can be beholden to their own audience in this branded era.
Or don't you think everybody's just so sure of themselves right now?
But there can be more consistency without being, on one side of every issue. There can be more philosophical consistency in how you think about something, more nuance in how you think about something. And that's why, all these leaked memos about how language is used, et cetera, they're actually showing something which is nuance, and they get grabbed in this reductive conversation and made the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots that's wrong with journalism, and it's a messy social practice. But it is occasionally good to be reminded that the people out there just really trying to gather facts and figure out what happened are the core of the enterprise.
And that's the kind of transparency we're missing. I think one trend that is happening, I don't think James is a fossil, but also as he was pointing out, right? And we have seen this, if you go back and revisit these editorial pages, they're just so wacky and off of the flow of history.
We're journalists. We don't know anything, right?
Yeah,
and there is a level, and that is the tension because I actually probably don't totally agree with James on the moral clarity stuff. I think there are times when journalists who have a very specific perspective ought to bring it, but
and not bringing it is actually a disservice, right?
But you got to realize how often we are wrong on the big picture, and you got to get the facts right. But you just have to open the possibility for doubt and for different interpretations and for the possibility that you're wrong in your analysis.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little out of fashion right now.
20 years on, think about it. It's 2024. James left the position. He was saying largely in 2004. It's been 20 years. Will it change in 20 years? It feels like it has not changed. It has not moved forward. It is the same exact thing. And 20 years from now,
I mean, I would anticipate being able to have that exact conversation with whoever is in that job right now in 20 years.
All right. Well, I guess we're going to have that conversation in 2044, which is really not something I'm deeply looking forward to, Ben. But before that, we'll be back next week with another episode. That's it for us this week. I think we're going to skip blind spots because we went a little bit long and we got a little depressing.
Sounds reasonable. Maybe in 2044, our avatars can have that conversation with each other while we're up doing something
Our
else.
AI-made podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Just remixing the same themes over and over.
Oh, God. Thank you for listening to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. Our show is produced by Max Tani, Allison Rogers, Sheena Ozaki, Max Toomey, Noah Friedman, Andrea Lopez Cruzado. Special thanks to Christina Stella, who helped us out last week. We'd also like to give a special thanks to Britta Galanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, and Jules Zern. Our engineer is Rick Kwan. Our theme music is by Billy Libby. And our public editor is Lexington. Explain what Lexington is, Ben, for people who don't know.
Lexington is the Economist column about the United States, written pseudonymously at the moment by James Bennet.
We've outed him. In fact, it's well known. If you like Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts and feel free to review us.
If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe there.
And as Max Tani would tell you, you should also be subscribed to Semaphore's media newsletter.